Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about meaningful engagement of people with lived experience. We know that's a hot topic in the field right now, that people are talking about it more and more, and we hope to provide you some concrete guidance. My name is Chris Ash, and my pronouns are they, them, and I am the Survivor Leadership Program Manager at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, where I manage the National Survivor Network. And I'm here with my colleague, Sophie Otiende, who was my co-author on a toolkit about meaningful engagement. Sophie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie Otiende, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. My pronouns are she, her. I'm really excited to be with Chris to discuss this because it's as Chris has said, it's a hot topic. And the biggest thing about hot topics is there's always a chance that the wrong information is shared. So we hope that we spend this time actually sharing the right information.
Thank you. So I know that we started this work writing this toolkit together. I had been working for a few years with this concept called the spectrum of survivor engagement, which we're now thinking of as the lived experience engagement spectrum. I had adapted this from the International Association of Public Participation spectrum of public participation, which is a way that they think of how to get communities involved, like what level of involvement and control do we give communities over decisions about that community, everything from zoning districts to maintaining infrastructure. And I thought this is a pretty interesting concept. What would it look like if, instead of having others decide how much power to give us, what if we thought about how much control and input and engagement do we need for different kinds of projects that we might be leading? So the levels are inform, ask, involve, collaborate, and empower. And the way that we think of this is inform is very important. All the levels are important. None of them is unimportant. But inform means we keep people with lived experience informed about decisions and information that impacts them. So that could be things like having plain language information on your website, making sure they can find where to get what they need. If you're doing research, inform means that you find ways to take your findings and make them accessible. If you're doing direct services, inform might be having accessible language consent forms and confidentiality explanations and grievance policies in people's language. Ask, we seek out and review feedback from people with lived experience and incorporate it. So that might look like surveying your current clients or past clients or both to find out about the services you're providing and if they're meeting their needs, what services they value more than others. Involve is where we start to bring people with lived experience in throughout our planning and implementation to consider their concerns. So that might mean something like a focus group or an advisory council. And that is where we bring them in before we start. Okay, before we write this grant, before we develop this program, what are some of the things you really want to see in this? And we get their input and we integrate it. Collaborate is where we're working closely with people who have lived experience as full partners. That's where you have survivors who are employees at your organization working in the same kinds of roles everyone else is working in. Not just employees with lived experience working as your survivor advocate or as a peer support specialist, but throughout the org. Everything from thinking about how to create a program, to implementing it, to figuring out final decisions, to helping you discern what you want to evaluate. Those would be employees, or maybe those contractors you work with so often that they might as well be part of your team, right? You're thinking of them as full team members. And empower is where you leave final decision-making power to the people with lived experience, and you're going to implement what they tell you, right? If it's not entirely survivor-led, then you're there as a support and as an ally. They tell you what they need, and you make it happen. So this is the lived experience engagement spectrum. And then I met Sophie, and Sophie had taken this same concept. Sophie, I don't know if you want to share anything about the latter.
Yes, I'd taken the same concept and actually thought about it as a ladder rather than as a spectrum, and basically looking at how lived experience or people with lived experience were being included in our current work. So just thinking about it as a ladder, starting from survivors, beneficiaries, and again, it basically goes, it's quite similar to the spectrum, but this one is in the form of a ladder. So starting with the fact that sometimes, and in many cases, what I was seeing around me is the idea that most of us getting to this work, starting to see survivors as beneficiaries. And we just never unlearned that. We never unlearned seeing survivors as beneficiaries in our program. And so survivors receive services but don't give feedback. And we see this a lot, right? We see that even when survivors actually give feedback about programs, especially as beneficiaries, it is seen as a complaint. It's really not feedback. It's seen as you complaining against the system. So, and then there's the next level, and to be honest, this level is a level for me personally. I came to see it a lot in the US and in the way survivor leadership has mainly been displayed in the US, where most of the time what I saw when people are talking about survivor leadership is survivors being brought into conferences, being brought into rooms to actually tell their stories, mainly being used for public relations, because we know at the end of the day, if a survivor says that a traumatic story, they will tag at people's hearts, and then this will lead to XYZ. And Chris and I have spoken back and forth, is the fact that, a traumatic story will bring awareness and will draw people just as important to the impact it does to the whole system. And I think the answer is no, we shouldn't be treating survivors as tokens. So I think looking at survivors as tokens is something that people do sometimes with good intentions. I've had places where people are like, we don't know how else to engage survivors, right? Or people will say survivors don't have skills, right? They don't have skills, therefore, the best way to involve them is through storytelling. The reality is that the survivors do have skills. We've just built a system that doesn't, engage with those skills. The next level is when people start, and this is where I feel many people end up staying for a long time, is when people start having advisory committees, start having advisory boards, bringing in a consultant in the organization to give feedback, to analyze your policies. This is working with survivors as consultants. It is, for me personally, I've seen it as very rare when survivors are actually co-creators. It's becoming more common, but the idea is trusting for survivors to actually co-create with you as people that have the ability, have the skills. And this sometimes can look different because, again, as I've said, many people have said survivors don't have the capacity. So if they don't have the capacity, then how can they co-create? And what I've said many times is it's possible to build in time and ways for skills to be built so that people can co-create with you. So the lack of skills should never be an excuse for not including people. It is possible for us to build within projects the ability to build, to nurture the skills we need, and then co-create with people so that we offer dignity if we want to. And the final one is survivors as leaders. And this is just, my hope is that we see this doesn't become, when a survivor is a leader of an organization or managing a program or any of those things, it stops being something that we talk about, because this should be the norm.
Thank you. Well, I realized as I heard about Sophie's ladder, where we want to see more and more meaningful and authentic survivor leadership, that they align with the different levels I had been thinking of. And Sophie's framework gave me the realization that in addition to needing to be doing well at each of these levels, we need to always be striving to do higher and higher levels of authentic survivor engagement. How do we increase If you're at that level where you're just hiring survivors to come in and share their stories or bringing them into your conference to share the stories, well, what do you need to do to get to the next level to where you're able to hire survivors as consultants and use their feedback? If you're at that level, what do you need to do to move to the next level, right? So the ladder gives us a framework for increasing and improving our framework. So putting it all together, the engagement spectrum asks us, what are the ways we engage survivors, and are we doing them well? Some people aren't even doing Inform well. I'm going to be honest. You go to their website and you can't tell anything about what they do. They maybe give survivors a stack of papers to sign when they walk in the door and are like, now you know the grievance policy. But that doesn't mean survivors actually know and understand their grievance policy and options. So are we doing the levels well? And then the ladder gives us this way of thinking, what is the highest level of inclusion in our decision making that we're doing successfully? Maybe you're doing okay with ask and consult, but you need to kind of loop back around and strengthen your Inform practices a little bit and then keep working your way up. So let me give me one moment. Okay, so when we think about these in practice, what are some things you can do at each level? So at the first level, Inform, we want to make sure that fact sheets, newsletters, websites, all your materials are in plain language. Are they disability accessible? Do you have captions on images that you use? Are you following best practices for screen readers? Are the colors on your website a good contrast? Is it accessible and available in people's language that they speak? You want to ensure that your safeguarding and grievance policies are easy to find and clear. So don't just hand them to them in the stack of papers to sign at intake. How do you revisit what your grievance policies are to make sure that people know what they are? We want to provide transparency in advance about how we're going to use that feedback, because sometimes survivors come in with one assumption about how their feedback is going to be used if they're coming in at the ask or consult level. And then when you don't make the changes that they're recommending, there can be this feeling that no one's even listening to you. So sometimes being transparent upfront about how you plan to use feedback can be helpful. You want to develop and implement feedback loops to follow up. So what we mean is, if someone files a grievance, we don't want to say, thank you so much, we'll take care of that, and then that's the last they ever hear about it. You want to come back afterwards and say, we're so grateful for you sharing that concern. We took it to our team and we changed the following policies to try to make sure this doesn't happen again, right? You want to give them that feedback. If someone participates in a focus group or an advisory council for a project, it's good practice once the project gets going to send them back an email or a letter and say, thank you so much for participating and sharing your insights. Here are 3 really great recommendations we were able to implement as a result of this focus group. You want to create an engaging and plain language impact report. We know that a lot of times organizations are writing their impact reports for funders and for donors and for the general public. But if people that you work with can't pick up your impact report and follow what you're doing, you need to rethink how you're doing your impact report. And we do this, the reason we do this is because if we don't think that people are even deserving of good information at this level, we're not going to be able to see them as colleagues one day, right? The challenges that make it hard to see people with lived experience as more than just beneficiaries in need of help or rescue or services. If we can't see them as whole beings who deserve information at this level, then we're definitely not going to be able to move up the spectrum. So at the ask level, consistently survey with people who have lived experience in your client base, consultants and staff about their experiences. We hear from a lot of folks that aren't asking their current clients or current beneficiaries about how it's going and how the program is meeting their needs because they're worried about power dynamics. I can tell you that if the questions you're putting on your survey are saying, how great are we on a scale of 1 to 5? Then of course they're going to feel a little bit of power dynamic, but rethink how you're asking those questions. What if you said, hey, we offer 5 primary services for our clients, please rank them in order of benefit to your life. Which one is most helpful to you? Which one is least helpful? Ask them, are there services that we aren't providing that we should be providing, or that we should look into providing? Because you may find that only 3 of your 5 services anyone finds helpful, which gives you room to kind of rethink in that next round of grant applications which 2 you might want to phase out and what you might want to bring in. You'll want to do focus groups of current clients, contractors, or staff, especially folks you know have lived experience, to ask them how are they experiencing your organization, right? If you notice when you do staff surveys, a lot of organizations do staff satisfaction surveys. If you know a few folks on your team who have disclosed lived experience and you find that they are regularly reporting higher job dissatisfaction, that might not be about their trauma. That might be about your organization. You're also going to want to compensate people with lived experience to review and provide feedback into your existing documents, plans, policies, or programs. We know that there's a lot of stuff that you've probably created without as much meaningful input from survivors along the way, and we don't expect you to just scrap it all and start from scratch. But start by having people go in and look at what you've been doing and give you meaningful feedback, and then make a commitment to, in the future, getting that feedback before developing new grant proposals, new programs, new policies and procedures. You're going to want at the involved level to conduct focus groups about their needs, about services and insights before you begin a project or program planning. You're going to want to have consultants who have lived experience, or consultant review teams is even better. We sometimes hear from people who say, I hired one survivor who experienced one type of trafficking one time in their life, and they reviewed our programs and gave us a little bit of feedback. Well, that's very limited feedback. What you're going to want to do is have a diverse team of people, maybe even a paid advisory council that can really give you a lot of feedback. And the one thing you want to remember is that we're not just hiring them because of their story. If you have a team looking at your housing and homelessness programs, for example, for survivors, and you have a team of 5 people reviewing your protocols, and 4 of the 5 have lived in shelter before, 1 of the 5 maybe has participated in a rapid rehousing fund at some point, 2 of the 5 have been shelter staff at some point, shelter assistant staff, and maybe you have 1 who served on their worked in their county trying to address homelessness issues. And that's in your 5 people in these different experiences. You're going to get feedback that gives you a much more holistic picture of what's possible, right? So we don't just hire to tokenize people. We think about what they're doing and what they know. Think about even with people who may not have the capacity or skill set to serve on your boards or as staff, they still have insight, and there's still going to be ways that you can engage them in offering advisory feedback. Collaborate. This is where you want to employ people with lived experience on staff or as contractors. You're also, rather than just going and hiring a bunch of people with lived experience and crossing your fingers and hoping for the best, you're going to want to be willing and have conversations with your board and among your leadership, among your program managers, about how this may mean there's some things we have to change about the way we do our work, right? That we don't just say we're going to hire some survivors and then watch our survivor employees have rapid turnover because we aren't willing to make changes and we aren't supporting them well. You're going to want to think about how we can really provide a supportive environment. We're not going to require them to share their stories of trauma just because they're survivor staff. We're not going to sit in the meeting and when we ask what survivors want, every other employee turns to look at them to see what they think personally because you're the survivor in the room, right? You're also going to want to develop leadership, internal lived experience leadership equity initiatives. So think about things like, do the people who come in who we know have lived experience in our team, do they have the same access to professional development? Are they using those opportunities for professional development? If not, what are the barriers? Are they too busy and their caseloads are too high to access time to take professional development? Do they have the same levels of compensation as other people doing similar jobs? Do they have similar levels of being able to move up? Do they have positions where there's upward mobility, right? We want to be thinking about that. And then the final level is empower. And at this level, we're thinking about having hired staff. Empower doesn't mean your entire staff has lived experience, right? Sophie and I both work in positions where we work with people who do and people who don't, and everybody's contributions matter and are important, right? But at the empower level, your organization is going to have staff who have lived experience in a good percentage of your managerial, executive, leadership, and decision-making positions. For a project or program, that means that the team is going to be led by people with lived experience, including for decision-making and budgetary concerns, right? This doesn't mean you hand people with lived experience a manager position and then give them extreme limitations that other program managers don't have around their budget, around their decision making. This means you're really treating them like the managers that they are. It also means you need to be thoughtful about who you're hiring into managerial positions, right? I think that sometimes there can be a very well-intentioned desire to put people with lived experience into leadership positions when you know they don't have the ability to succeed at that level, right? That's not empowering. That's tokenizing, and it's also harmful, right? It can lead that person to feel really discouraged and burn out very quickly. So again, the core of all of this is if we're just hiring someone for their trauma history and putting them in whatever level we can put them in to say we are doing survivor leadership, that's tokenizing. But if we look at someone's broad skills and knowledge and what places they have skills and knowledge we can start to develop and help them grow into the kind of leadership they want, that's empowerment. That's empowering. I'm going to turn it over to Sophie now.
Thank you so much for that. I think when listening to you, Chris, one of the things that comes up to me when I think about empower is really that at empower level, that you've built a system that automatically includes survivors and instinctively ensures that they can and have the ability to get to the highest level in your organization. And all those other things happen just instinctively. So at empower level, you've built a system. It's not just you've hired people. At empower level, you've built a system that is inclusive and actively does the work to ensure that, people with lived experience get to the highest level in your organization based on a particular system, right? That is not tokenism. So, and that's why it's important as we are talking about empower to really define power, right? To define power, because this is something that when it comes to including people with lived experience, we hear a lot, right? We hear a lot about power dynamics. We hear a lot about sharing, the need to share power, but we never quite discuss what power is. So power is the ability or capacity to have authority or influence over decisions and outcomes. And it's important as we talk about inclusion. Inclusion is about letting go of control and handing over power. So you need to think about what your power as an institution looks like and what handing over looks like. So what do we talk about when we talk about institutional power? Institutional power means that you're part of the group, that the institutions were created by and for. And it makes a difference if an institution was created for you, because it means that a system instinctively thinks about you, instinctively thinks about your needs, instinctively sees your contribution, right? Instinctively validates your experience. So institutional power really is important. And most, when we look at our sector and setup as it is, most of the institutions that currently exist weren't designed and created for people with lived experience. So it's really important for us to reflect. So we wanted to put a few reflections as we're talking about power. And the first reflection is, have you ever felt like you needed to stay silent about an important issue in the workplace because you thought someone would think it was personal, or you are just pushing an agenda? And this is not, again, this is not just about lived experience. If you're a woman at the workplace and something happens, right? And you feel afraid of complaining because you know it will be said that the only reason why you're complaining is because you're a woman.
Mm-hmm. I've had similar things when I've been in a workplace and heard someone using the wrong pronouns for a client. In our staff meetings, maybe they use the right pronouns in front of the person, but they're using the wrong pronouns in our staff meeting. And I know that I should say something and be like, hey, we're getting this wrong, but I'm afraid that people will say, oh, of course you would say that. You know what I mean? Without realizing that I'm not just saying it because I have a personal agenda, I'm saying it because that really shows something about how you see this client.
Yeah, and as you reflect about this is also another important place where allyship is really important, right? Because when you feel this uncomfortable, this is always the best time for an ally to stand up and say something. But in most cases, when something happens, everyone will look at the person that it affects to complain.
Mm.
And that's the problem. That's not sharing power, that's disempowering. So sharing power in this moment would be for someone who this doesn't affect to be the one to speak up, because then they don't feel like, no one will feel like they're pushing an agenda. And we know that their feedback will be taken as objective rather than someone who is affected by the issue.
That's a very good point.
So it is extremely important in any room. I think it's important, first of all, to realize that power looks differently in every room. In every situation, it looks different. And you need to consistently ask, who has the power? Who has the power in this particular room? There are places where I have power, there are places where somebody else has power. And the only way we can create an inclusive and empowering space is by consistently questioning the person with the most power in the room and why they have that power at any point. And some of the things that would get you to understand who has power in the room is who gets to self-identify whether or not they have lived experience of trafficking in a room, if we're talking about our sector. How does that affect their experiences in the sector? I am an educator, and one of the most important things for me to recognize at any point in any room about who has power is who gets quoted, who gets listened to, and who gets to be seen as objective in a room. Like, who gets to be seen as an expert. That usually will tell you most of the time who has power. Like, who's the expert? Most of the time, who makes decisions. And sometimes it's not the person who's speaking. You could have been in situations where we've been told this is a lived experience, survivor-led conference. But at the end of the day, the person who is paying the bill gets to decide several things that it doesn't matter whether you call it what you call it. They are the final decision makers. So if you are talking about sharing power, you have to question who has it and how does it exist in a room.
I'm thinking, Sophie, as you share that, about a time where I heard someone was going to be speaking at a very important event. There were 6 people speaking, and 3 of them had lived experience, and 3 of them had really strong professional credentials. And the planners of the event had actually written lived experience and had written those 3 names, and then wrote experts and had the other 3 names. And what I love about this situation is that one of the people who did not have lived experience went and called in the planners and told them to change it. And I thought that was really powerful, but that does still, whether we change the words on the sheet or not, that gives us that show that it's kind of like you let it show without meaning to how
Yeah.
you think about people.
Yeah. And I know you and I, Chris, have discussed this over and over again. Like you and I have professional experience that many people in the field have without our lived experience, right? Without our lived experience, our professional credentials are just as strong as any other practitioner in the space. But anytime we show up, we don't get to show up with our professional credentials, and we don't complain about it, but the first thing that people think is not that we manage whole institutions, is that we are people with lived experience, and that needs to stop. It needs to, erasing someone's whole career, education, and everything, and putting and equating it to just lived experience is not empowering. And it's very, very disempowering. So the fact that if you enter any room and you get to be who you want to be, that's a privilege. That's power that many people do not have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're kind of speaking some to the next slide, so I just went ahead and switched next.
Mm. So I spoke about like what skills are valued in the sector, who gets hired, and into what kind of positions. One of the things that is quite interesting is even when people decide that they want to hire survivors, that and Chris spoke about this earlier, even when people decide they want to hire survivors, they want to hire them for a survivor exclusive position.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's not that this is like I don't hear people wanting to hire, especially survivors, for positions that are in the background. I don't hear people say they want to hire survivors as accountants. I don't hear people say they want to hire survivors as, monitoring and evaluation. Most of the time, the positions that survivors get, you recognize very quickly when you come into this sector that the positions that are there and exclusively for survivors are positions that are in the public, are positions that require you to be a good communicator, despite the fact that not all survivors are good communicators. Some survivors want to do other things, but not creating a system that distributes that power and ensures that survivors can get into the positions that they want and are aligned with their skills is not sharing power.
I think about too, sometimes when we get hired into those other positions, they want to put special parameters.
Yes.
I saw this recently. There was an organization that ended up hiring a survivor with technical skills to help manage the database. And there was a big, long conversation about whether or not this person should have access to the client portions of the database. This is not a former client. This is just someone who they knew had lived experience. And it's like, would your other database manager have access to that portion of the database if you had hired someone without lived experience? And what does it say about what we believe about survivors if we think that someone's lived experience itself means that they can't be trusted with confidentiality clauses that other employees can be? You know?
Yeah, and also the reality is that some of the work that is exclusive for is rather survivor or lived experience exclusive are the ones that pay less. In most cases, they're consultancies. Right? If we're being honest, in most cases, they're consultancies that are short time. And then those consultancies are not valued at the same rate any other consultancy would be valued or would be paid. So ask yourself, do you have special rates for survivors? If you do, you are tokenizing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the space, because we're also in the development space, it's also who do donors listen to. We can't not talk about that, because who do donors entrust their funding to? Because the reality is that we can speak all day, but if donors do not trust that the decisions, the solutions, the ideas that people with lived experience and communities bring to the table is valuable, they won't invest in them. And that power and that status quo will remain, because money does control how people move and think and what gets done or doesn't get done. So it's really, really important. The conversation of also sharing power is about donors entrusting money to organizations that display whatever we are saying. So if donors do not move in this direction, do not fund this work in that same way, and I'm happy that this is the direction that GFAMS is going, that we want to be able to fund in a way that shows where we place our values, and that value is in communities, is in people with lived experience, because they know what they're doing. And I know that when people share, when we talk about sharing power, there's the question of, people always make it seem like by sharing power, you deplete like the power that you have, you become disempowered. So if I share my power, then I become disempowered. And when the reality is that power is so interesting in the sense that the more we share it, the bigger it becomes, the more powerful we become as a group. So it's really important for us to really think about that. But also power is about accountability, right? We can't, without power, it's hard to have accountability. It's hard to question. It's hard to say anything. And I have said this before, that the crime of trafficking, and we've discussed this before with somebody else, the crime of the biggest thing about trafficking and modern slavery is agency, right? It completely, the person that is being abused completely does, their agency is taken away. So if we are to really, really, heal or repair whatever damage this crime did to us, it's really not by holding on to more power, it's really by handing agency. So less control, right? So we also talk about like meaningful inclusion. What does it, and by sharing power, then we are more inclusive, then we have all the people that we need. And looking at this picture makes us look at different things. And we talk about a seat all the time. When we talk about inclusion, we talk about a seat in the table, a seat in the table. I don't like the the language of a seat in the table, because I find it very limiting. Tables are limiting. Tables can only hold a certain amount of people. So I prefer seats in a field, because fields are expansive. Seats are expansive, right? I prefer seats, and in fields we can sleep. Tables are just, I don't like tables because they're limiting. And also, that's why we are thinking about inclusion the way we think about inclusion, right? Because if a table has 12 people, we start asking who will leave so that a survivor leader or a person with lived experience can take their place. And no one wants to leave the table. No one wants to leave. If we're being honest, no one wants to leave the table. So, and I don't think anyone should leave the table. Movement building thinking is not about anyone leaving the table. It's just about everyone being there, right? Everyone being there doing what they're supposed to be doing. So when you're thinking about inclusion, some of the things to think about, if you're thinking about the field and not the table, Some of the things to think about is for equality, were people with lived experience invited, and not just invited, who did they invite? Because the reality is that sometimes when certain people do not have the trust, the integrity, and the things that would draw people with those communities to come. And that's the reality. There's a relationship required for invitation to be accepted. The same way you wouldn't just invite people in the streets to come to your wedding, is the same way we need to think about invitation, especially when you're thinking about things that we are doing. Equity, thinking about what are the barriers, because there are barriers to people coming, and have we overcome those barriers? I remember going to a conference where they had said they were inviting people. It was a conference for young mothers with children with disability. A long time ago, I used to work with young mothers with children with living with a disability. And first of all, just the location of the conference. So they put the conference in the morning, and then did not provide us anything to make sure that, you know, these young mothers who had children who are 100% dependent on them could leave their children with. So I asked, have we planned for them to come with children? And the answer was no, we haven't planned for them to come with children. So are we paying for daycare? And then they were like, no, we don't have the budget for that. And so the question is, how are these young mothers supposed to make it for this meeting in the morning, early in the morning? And basically what they said is, oh, we couldn't be able to mobilize. The reality is not that you couldn't be able to mobilize. The reality is that you are not willing to overcome the barriers to ensure that participation, that these people participate. And diversity, which is something, I find it something that is quite interesting, especially when we speak about lived experience in this space. So that if you want, it's not just about diversity, it's diversity in different things, right? Chris' experience of trafficking is very different from my experience. I come from a very different community from the community that Chris comes from. It's all those different layers and thinking about all those people coming into the room, because you don't want anybody speaking on behalf of another person. You want everyone to be able to speak for themselves. So therefore, what measures do we need to put in place so that all the different identities are in the room? Yeah.
Well, I know we're getting close to time, and there's a PDF of the slides that has these next few slides so you can really dig into the details. But briefly, I'm going to go through these next few concepts and just name that when we're trying to increase survivor engagement, there are some tensions where there's two things that are both important and they make the other hard. They each make the other hard. So we want to be accessible for survivors to learn on the job, to have really extended onboarding. We want to recognize that professionalism is sometimes used to exclude people, but we also recognize organizations have to be sustainable, right? We may not have on certain projects or certain tasks a lot of time to invest in mentoring. We may have a timeline that's tight. And we also recognize that while professionalism and education are often used to exclude survivors, that there's some behaviors that are just going to damage our workplace culture or our workplace partnerships. And we need to think about how we hold these two things that seem to be in contradiction in a nice balance. I think that comes up a lot also when we look at people who have lived experience of trafficking is important. They give you insights that can't be replaced, but sometimes professional and work experience skills are really necessary for certain kinds of jobs. And we need to hold that tension in reality, hold that tension thoughtfully so we can navigate it carefully, a lot of times you're going to find people who have lived experience and professional and workplace skills, right? The other thing I want to name, because I don't hear it named enough in the anti-trafficking sector, is that having lived experience of other diversity, equity, and inclusion related experiences and identities is also important. Because if you have 3 survivors on your advisory council and they're all white, then there's a good chance that your staff who are Black or Indigenous or brown-skinned Latina or any other identities, they probably have insights into how racism operates in your services that those 3 survivors may not fully understand, right? So we want to be really thoughtful about keeping our survivor inclusion efforts really integrated with our DEI efforts to make sure that we're respecting staff who have other identities, even if they don't have lived experience, that give them valuable insights. We want to be trauma-informed and accountable. Trauma-informed does not mean that anything goes, right? We want to give people grace when they're struggling, and also that grace should never be unending in the workplace. So how do we hold that need to be trauma-informed with our need to be accountable for how we treat each other in the workplace? And these are both and, right? So all of these situations are both and. So when we've experienced trauma, we hope our organizations will work to not take advantage of that. And as an organization, trying to keep from ever upsetting someone, that's a trauma response that can trap us in unhealthy dynamics. I've been in that situation too. I know we all have, to where you have someone in the workplace who has a lot of trauma and you're wanting to be super thoughtful and giving grace. And we get into the thing to where we're afraid to ever say anything at all because we're scared of upsetting them. But that's also a trauma response. So how do we create truly trauma-informed workplaces, right? That's a tricky thing. So I think I'd love to shift into Q&A and conversation now, just to ask, did any of that resonate for those of you listening today? And how does that land for you?